And we're live. Welcome to this live coding session. My name is Jim. I'm your host, and we're going to talk about, you can ask questions just before we get started. There's a chat function at the bottom, and there's a Q&A. I'd prefer you to use the Q&A button to ask your questions. And if you press that, you can ask questions. I'll just look periodically to see if there's questions. Right, so let me start by sharing my screen and we'll talk about what we're going to do. It's open source Hopsworks. So Hopsworks, many will know about. It's a platform for the development and operation of machine learning applications at scale. And the web page for it is hopsworks.ai. And if you go in here, you can see there's a menu item here, open source. So if you go to open source, it tells you a couple of ways of installing the platform. One is what it calls quick install. And it says it needs to install it on a virtual machine. And you'll need a virtual machine. It needs to be an Ubuntu virtual machine. Version 18 is currently supported, or a CentOS or Red Hat Linux version. So currently 7.x is supported. I think we'll have 8. I think 8 actually might be working already, and 20 Ubuntu is coming within a few weeks. There's another way to install it. If you have Azure command line interpreter installed or the Google CLI installed, you can actually use a script which will create the virtual machines for you and then install the platform for you. So if you have those installed, you can. There's none for AWS currently. The other option, if you just really want to get started quickly, is to go to register here on hopsworks.ai, and you'll get like a virtual machine, and you get a free demo cluster to get started with. So you can kind of spin up a machine very quickly here, but we're not going to do that. We're going to go with open source version. In terms of open source, it's all available on GitHub. So we can quickly look at GitHub here. And we can see that if you're interested in the license, the open source license, it's an AGPL v3 license. So you're free to use this software, install it, and if you don't make any changes to it, you're free to charge for services and do whatever you want. If you make changes, you're supposed to release your changes as open source if you want to charge for services on it. But otherwise, it's an approved open source license. So there, we don't have commit or questions here. So if you have questions, we actually send people to hopsworks.community. And that's not Hopsworks. Where is it? I'll just Google it because I've totally forgotten. My COVID brain has gone on the Hopsworks community. It's a community.hopsworks.ai. Yeah, sorry, community.hopsworks.ai. And you can ask questions here. So this is a discuss forum. So you can see there's a bunch of questions here, and some of the questions related to installation, of course. If we go back here, there's also an installer doc with a little bit more details. So you can go in here, and this is, like I said, Red Hat 7, Ubuntu 18. The installer by default will install the full platform for you. And we have, it'll probably work with 16 gigabytes of RAM, but we recommend 32. And we recommend 8 CPUs. It'll work with 4. And it requires, there's some Docker images in there. So 100 gigabytes is what we recommend. If you use the Google command line interpreter or the Azure CLI, it'll create a virtual machine with these specs by default. And there's a bit more. If you have your own virtual machine, there's a bit more setting up you can do. And if you're going to install on many servers, you have to set up something called passwordless SSH between the servers. If you do it on the GCP or Azure, it'll do it for you. It'll set that up for you. If you're behind a firewall, that's kind of, we have some early support for it, but it's not foolproof. So we noticed that it doesn't work in a bunch of situations. So you can try it, but there's no guarantees it will work. If you want to do a fully air-gapped installation, so the installer will go to the internet to download a lot of data. So so don't do this over your 3G connection, would be my advice. Do it over a non-metered internet connection. It's going to download all of the software and a lot of packages. If you're air-gapped, so if you don't have outbound access to the internet, if you're going behind a HTTP proxy and it doesn't work for you, then it's best just to contact sales@logicalclocks.com. So the platform can be installed in air-gapped environments, but it's a bit intricate and involved, and there's no public documentation on that. Every air-gapped environment is different. There's no generic solution to it. There's a few things if you're going to install in Azure that The virtual machines you get there don't have DNS, private DNS zones enabled by default, so you need to enable that, and the host names end up being too long, so your host name should be quite short. You know, you can read through a bit more of this. Under the hood, what's happening actually is it's downloading a lot of packages. It's using two tools to install the platform. One is called Caramel, which orchestrates the execution of something called Chef Solo. So Chef Solo is, it's Chef, but there's no server. So there won't be anything installed running on your server after you've finished installation. The only contact it'll make back to our platform is it'll ask for an email. You don't need to provide that. It'll skip over it if you let it time out. And there's a bit more here on you can install on Vagrant virtual machines, but we're going to install on a virtual machine here. And I'll see if there's any questions before we're going to go. I don't see any questions lying around, so let's just dive in. So I just, before we were doing it, like, because it takes, if we go back, look at the time, it takes about an hour for this to install, right? So it's quite a, takes quite a while. So I just ran this before we came on air. And I'll just show you what I did, right? So first thing, I had a virtual machine pre-prepared. Now I can show you this cloud installer script to create the virtual machines for you. Many people, if you're particularly in an enterprise, you mightn't have the privileges to create virtual machines. So if you're a GCP user, you'll see that there's this gcloud command line interface, and you can call gcloud. And I don't remember. Let's see what my gcloud commands are. Actually, I have some here on this laptop. Gcloud init. No, I'll go with config, I think, is it? But we can try init. So init will basically try and log you in, and you can see here, I've already set it up to have a region and a zone and the account, and you log in on your web page. I'm not going to create a new configuration, so I'll just press Control-C. So you need to set up your command line tool, and it's the same for Azure. I think I have Azure here. AZ, I think AZ is config, actually, the command on them. No, it's configure, okay. And I don't remember exactly the command. So you can see in Azure I've set it up as well. You need to have something called a resource group set up. It's going to be in the region as well, or location. And then it needs to create, so this is the resource group here, Hopsworks. And then we have a virtual network it's going to install in. It'll also need a sub network, and it'll create a private DNS zone. So there's quite a few things involved in Azure for their virtual machines are very limited to start off with. Okay, so if you want to install with the command line tool, I'll just briefly go through it without running all the way. You can just use the -H. You can see there's a -H for help. And you can see there's quite a lot of options. Now, I won't be able to go through all of these options. Some of them are specific to Azure. Some of them are specific to GCP. And I'll just point out the most important things. Okay. So the most important thing to begin with is that if you want to make this feature store accessible from the outside, so if you would like to run a Python program that writes features of the feature store and reads features, or you want to run a Spark program from outside, maybe from Databricks or some Cloudera or whatever type of cluster you have, you'll need to open these ports. So you'll need to open 443, which is the web server port for Hopsworks running on HTTPS. We then have 8020, and that's the TLS-enabled port for the name node in Hopsworks. So if you're writing from Spark, for example, it will write directly to the file system on our platform. And then we have ports for Hive. So you can see we have, so Hive has, we have a Metastore, and then there's the Hive server 2. And then we have a port for a data node on this particular virtual machine that we'd spin up, because you'll need to write to the data node in the file system. So in the cloud, in our managed version, the data will be stored in a bucket in S3, but in the open source version, the data will be stored on the local disks of your virtual machine. Now, another port you might want to consider opening up is 9090 if you want to follow the installation on a web browser. It's not necessary. I prefer to follow it here. You can see it just prints out the command line. You can see it's basically running what we call recipes, so console, elastic, flink, and so on. So let's go through some of these options before we start. So firstly, there's different versions. There's community, community cluster, enterprise, and Kubernetes. If you want to install enterprise or Kubernetes, you need to get a username and password from Hopsworks company, so contact them. But you can go ahead and run with community. Then you have to specify your cloud. Now, currently only GCP and AWS are working. There's an option for Azure. There's an option for AWS, but it's not currently working. And you can do a dry run to see what happens. You can give GPUs to workers, and you can specify the type of GPU. Not all types are supported here currently, but you can easily edit this bash script if you want to add your own type. So the A100 is not here, as you might notice, just the V100s. And then if you're going to install the enterprise version, you need to put in the URL for that, but otherwise you won't need to put any URLs for anything. Other things you can do is you can give the virtual machines a name, a prefix, so that you can find them easily enough. And you know, if you're debugging and there was some issue, you can skip the creation and just go and install the platform on the already created virtual machines. You can also configure, of course, the size of the workers, and you can say how many CPUs they should have, or just give the worker instance type, which is often a little bit easier. And specifically for Azure, we need a private DNS zone, a virtual network, a resource group, and a virtual network. So you can give the names of those if they're already, if you have a virtual machine created already, or if they already exist and have been created in your Azure account or resource group. And similarly for GCP, with some other options, you can attach NVMe drives. And in GCP, it's a little bit nicer. You can stop and start your virtual machines, so you only pay for them when you use them, and you can even suspend them and resume them, which is very fast, actually. So you pay a little bit more, but if you want to turn it off on a Friday, you can. So what you often do is you might say, okay, let's have a look and see what's available here. I did the wrong one. It's cloud is GCP. So you can choose GCP or Azure or AWS. So I've got a couple of virtual machines running. One I just installed now. If you want to go through this installer that creates the virtual machines, you pick your cloud. It'll ask you when you're installing it. So, you know, I could say Azure, and just walk my way through it. And I'll just go with a single host community version with CPUs, and I'll give it a prefix. I'll just give it an ed. Then, yeah, it's asking you the subscription, and we take the default, which is yes, and your location. So it's going to ask you a few questions about the resource group you want to put it in. I didn't, you know, feed these in the command line. Virtual network, that one existed. A private DNS zone, network links. There's a few things that need to be created in Azure, and then it goes ahead and creates a virtual machine, and it gives you the size of it and so on, and it will install it. Now I'm not going to go through all of this because it takes Azure is quite slow in doing that. So what I'll do is I'll actually show you. Let's go back. Let's look at the machine I just created, and we'll look in and see what happened. Right. So what will happen is it will actually run the installer script. So that's a cloud installer script, which just creates the virtual machines and configures them and sets them up so that you can install the platform. So this is the one I just created, JDCPU, and you can SSH into it. Actually, it's complaining. So let's have a look at this. Okay, so it actually says your key has changed. So let's see, did I get the right one here? Okay, so all right, this is the one. Actually, I'm already logged in. So anyway, I'm already logged in. Sorry, I'm logging in for the wrong machine. So what will actually happen is I created that particular one from here from my laptop, and I'm logged into another one of our development servers. So what actually happens when you run the cloud installer script, it will take your public key. So if we look at this particular machine in the authorized keys, what it'll do is actually paste my public key from the machine I installed it on. And that machine is here, it's called Snurl, and I paste this public key in here. So I'll be able to just SSH into it. And it'll be the same username as you have in your command line. So I'm in on the machine here. So what actually happens, and if you have your own virtual machine, what you're going to do is run this installer script here. And this is the one that actually installs the platform. So again, we have some command line options. They look a little bit different. It's basically saying, do you want to install on the local host, so just on this virtual machine? Typically, you'll put it with TLS. You'll enable TLS, which I did. You can also install a cluster. If you're going to install a cluster, you'll have to pass in a list of worker names. So it'll be the IP addresses of all the workers, and you'll have to have the same username as we have here. So in this case, the username is J Dowling, and that user will have to exist on all of these IP addresses, and will need to have passwordless SSH access to them. If you don't know what passwordless SSH access is, you can read on the help documentation. Because what's going to happen is this machine will SSH into the other machines, and this account will also need sudo privileges on the other machines. So if there's a password associated with the sudo, you'll need to pass it in here. You can pass also as an environment variable if you prefer. And then it will SH into the machines or Caramel, the orchestration tool, with and run the chef recipes on all the servers. The other options here, non-interactive, you can actually, you don't need to run the script interactively. You can pass in all the options and then use the NI switch to say, okay, just run this without asking me for confirmation on everything. But let's go ahead and just try and run it and we'll see what happens, right? So if we run the script, it basically starts out by having a look at the machine you're installing on and says, is there enough memory? Is there enough disk space on the root partition? It can also use the mount partition because some clouds use that for mounting disks. And it looks at number of available GPUs and CPUs, the type of file system you're using, your IP, the user installing it as, the version of Linux you're installing, and then the actual cluster definition you're installing. It's actually going to pull the cluster definition from this particular branch on Git. It's actually going to go to Git and download the cluster definition. We'll look at that in a second. And it's giving me a warning because I actually started the cluster running and saying, hang on a second, you're running a bunch of services on this machine. This will cause problems. So, I probably shouldn't install, but we can have a quick look through. I won't install it again, but we'll see what happens. It asks me if I'm behind a HTTP proxy. I'm not. Put in your email address. It won't, invalid email address. Okay, we do that again. I didn't think that was checking. So we'll go, this is my Gmail address. There's no secret. So, and then it asks you what I want to install. So I might say, well, I'll do I'll take this one, number 2, but I'm not going to install it at this point. So we'll just cancel that. So what it actually is installing, if you're curious, is it's running a program called Caramel, and Caramel is not running at the moment, but the program that actually runs is the following. It goes into Caramel 0.6 and it runs this program Caramel. And Caramel takes some options. So one of the options is launch, and that's the cluster definition you want to run. And if you need a password, a pseudo password, you pass it in as well. So the cluster definition is in a directory called cluster definitions. It was created. It's created by both scripts, by the cloud installer and the normal installer. And you can pass in the one called Hopsworks installation.yaml. So we can have a look at that script if you're curious. Let's have a look. Cluster definitions, Hopsworks installation. And this is what's actually telling you the services that are being installed. It's going to install it as the username Dowling. This is where it's going to pull the code from. So I'm installing the latest version on master. You probably should have a version number here, like 2.4, 2.5. We're installing a GCP. There's a couple of things that get configured for that. So connectors to different databases and so on. And then our hops platform, there's some configuration options here for yarn. And then we have our database, RonDB, some configuration options there. And all of this is configurable. So there's a ton of things you can configure here. And this installer script will automatically generate credentials for all of the services. And so you'll find the credentials in here. So keep this, you want to save this particular file. Also, if you're going to upgrade, you need to have this file to do an upgrade. So to run an upgrade, you run Caramel again and just change your version here from the branch to be 2.4 to 2.5 or to 3.0. So then if we go down, we'll see that we have the cluster definition here. So we're going to have one node, it'll be our head node, we're calling it meta server, and it's going to install a bunch of chef packages in here. So after this, if you have a cluster, you might have some more nodes. You might have worker nodes defined with the services they install, probably not as many as the head node. And then your installation proceeds. Now, the way to follow your installation is to follow this file called installation.log, where it'll get written to. And what it does, firstly, it tries to SSH to the machines. If you haven't set up passwordless SSH, it may fail at this point. Then it connects to the machines. There's a bunch of tests at the beginning to make sure the operating system type is supported, and that we can install the essential libraries and apt, and that Chef can be installed because we're going to use Chef solo. And then it goes ahead and installs all the recipes. And at the very end, you can see it says DAG is done, Hops DAG is done. And not a very grand, this little smiley thing here. So I finished one already, and that was this one here. Did I pull it up? No, I didn't. Okay, let's have a look at it. The IP address was here. Okay, and let's pull it open. So it's a HTTPS. Now, what we do is, you can see it's a self-signed certificate that we get here. So you mightn't think, oh, self-signed certificate, I don't want that. It's running a web application server called Pyara. So Pyara is open source as well. So what you can do is, I'm just starting to run a demo project, by the way. So I just logged in, and because you get a self-signed certificate, you do have to say accept warning, and you get this little not secure thing up here in the corner. Now, what we do on our managed platform, if I was to go to our managed platform, is that you do get, of course, a proper certificate there. If you're running on premise, and you can, in our enterprise version, we'll install a valid certificate. But the managed platform here is actually using it's using a nice service out there. We'll see it in a second, which is I'll just log in. A single sign-on for this. Okay. So I haven't done much here. So you can probably do this yourself. It's a little bit of work, but you can see that it's the yeah, I forgot that. My COVID brain has gotten me. I'm sorry. This is not telling me the certificate is valid. Okay, yeah, here we go. Sorry. So it's Let's Encrypt, of course. There are billions of Let's Encrypt certificates out there. So the issue with the Let's Encrypt, if you are in an enterprise setting, is that it requires you to actually open a port during installation to allow it to validate your hosting. And in the enterprise setting, often we have customers who don't want that, so we have to set up a certificate for them there. Okay, so I just ran the demo project. You have these things called projects in Hopsworks when it gets created, and you can create new projects. And if you run the demo one in the feature store, what you'll get is basically a job starts running. So you can see this job is executions in progress. It's actually a Spark job. If we have a look at it in more detail, you can see there's a bunch of windows here. So so it's a Spark job. You can see it's running away there. It's Spark 310, and this is only a single virtual machine, so there's not a huge amount of resources on it. So it's probably just running one little executor. You can see here with one core, and that'll put her along in the background. When that job is finished, it'll actually populate a bunch of feature groups here. So we can have a look at. I think a couple of them should be written at this stage. And then after that, it'll actually create some training data. So it's so maybe it hasn't written any yet. Okay. So that's basically, then you get Hopsworks. Now, for getting started with Hopsworks, I think we have some other videos, so that wasn't the goal of today. I'll jump back here to say a couple more words. So one thing I mentioned was if you're using the cloud installer, you can start and stop these virtual machines. So if I type in -L, and you can delete them, of course. So -L gave me nothing because I forgot to say which cloud I'm looking at. So we need to know which cloud to look at. So I put in the CGCP and said, oh, look, I've got a couple of these running. So I can actually just type in RM, and then it'll ask me which one of these do I want to delete. So I need to put in the name. So this is the name here. And if I paste that in there, and I'll do it because I don't need that one anymore. So I can delete it. It'll actually start deleting it. Another thing you can do is you can start and stop them. So I can stop this virtual machine because I'm not going to need it again tonight. Probably not for a couple of days if I'm going down with COVID. Suspend is really nice in GCP because suspend will make it not available for a very short period of time. Stop is going to connect to the cluster, and then every service on the platform is actually a systemd service. So it's going to run stop on the service before it actually stops the virtual machine. Now, stopping a virtual machine in the cloud means you don't pay for running the virtual machine, but you do pay a small amount for the storage of the EBS drive or the volume on the disk. So don't leave it lying there forever. You can start them again. All right, we're just over time. So thanks for listening, and please reach out to community.hopsworks.ai for more questions about how to get started. Thanks everyone, and have a great day.